titled, Is Ron DeSantis Getting Ready to Pull a Jeb Bush? And you will recall that Jeb Bush basically stole the election for his brother George in 2000. This was 22 years ago. For those of you who are too young to remember the details of it, it wasn't a secret. It was right out in front of the world. In fact, the BBC did a major documentary on it several months after it happened. After George W. Bush had been installed as our president. It wasn't just the Supreme Court that gave Bush the White House. The Supreme Court shut down the recount of the Florida vote. Keep in mind, George W. Bush won Florida by 537 votes. And had he not won Florida, Al Gore would be president. If Al Gore had won Florida, that was it. Game over. Al Gore would have become president. And frankly, he should have become president because of all this election fraud. Now, this is not voter fraud. This is election fraud, which the Republicans have been doing for the better part of 40 years. This really started in 1981 when Ronald Reagan took office. And I'll walk you through all this. It was pretty breathtaking, really. Jeb Bush and well, first of all, Florida and Texas are the only two states in the union where the governor picks the Secretary of State, which is where I'm going to be leading you with Ron DeSantis in just a moment. But, well, in fact, I'll give away the punchline right now. Ron DeSantis just picked an absolute wackadoodle. I'll give you all the details in a few minutes, as his Secretary of State, a Trump-humping election denier who, is, in my opinion, going to rig, if he's not doing it right now, the Florida election. So what happened in Florida in 2000? All the polls showed that the election was a dead heat, and in fact, there was a slight edge for Al Gore in Florida. So Jeb Bush had to figure out a way to get rid of at least, a few thousand, ideally a few tens of thousands of Democratic voters. The easy way to do that would be to get rid of black votes. And, the old tried and true method that Republicans have been using for years to suppress the black vote is to put crappy voting machines or, dysfunctional equipment in black neighborhoods, so that you have high levels of what's called ballot spoilage. And in fact, in Florida, those levels were, pushing 14% of black ballots were spoiled statewide in that election, whereas 1.6% of white ballots were spoiled. Spoiled means something had happened so that the ballot couldn't be read. Now, the Republican response to that was, oh yeah, those black people, they're just ignorant, and they don't know how to fill out a ballot. I mean, literally, that's what people like Roger Stone were saying in 2000. And, it's absolutely not the case. In fact, a federal agency looked into this, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and they concluded that voter education, voter competence, black or white, it doesn't matter, had absolutely nothing to do with this. This was a premeditated effort to crush the black vote in Florida. In fact, I'll just read you. These are all quotes from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is a federal agency. It was created in 1957 by an act of Congress. Keep in mind, George Bush won the election in Florida by 537 votes, and that's what put him in the White House. These are the quotes from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. They did this study a year after Bush was put into the White House. Number one, black voters were nearly 10 times more likely than non-black voters to have their ballots rejected. Number two, 14.4% of Florida's black voters cast ballots that were never counted. They were rejected. This compares with approximately 1.6% of non-black Florida voters who did not have their presidential votes counted. Number three, Florida's I'm quoting from a federal oversight agency. Florida's overzealous efforts to purge voters from the rolls, and that's the key to this. I'm going to get to that in a second. Conducted under the guise of an anti-fraud campaign, resulted in an inexcusable and patently unjust removal of disproportionate numbers of African-American voters from Florida's voter registration rolls for the November 2000 election. Quote, In the state's largest county, Miami-Dade, more than 65% of the names on the purge list were African Americans who represented only 20.4% of the population. And they go on, from there. So what happened? Well, those of you who are longtime listeners to this program will recall, a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, when my book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, came out, Greg Palast came on this program. He was the BBC reporter who exposed this to the world. That BBC report, which is the two YouTubes of it are attached to the very bottom of my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com if you want to see it. That never played in the United States, but it went absolutely viral in the UK and around Europe. Every European knew that George W. Bush, or that Jeb Bush, had stolen the election for his brother George W. But Americans, not so much. So how did Jeb Bush manage to make sure that African Americans in Florida, tens of thousands of African Americans got bounced off the voting rolls, and that didn't happen to white people? Well, it was a combination of two things. The main one was what's called a merge-purge, or a purge. The Texas felon list, keep in mind George W. Bush was the governor of Texas at the time. The Texas felon list was generously provided to the Florida Secretary of State, Katherine Harris. And that felon list, of course, is about a little over 2/3 black and Hispanic. Now, white people, the last names of white people pull from a huge variety of languages. Russian, Ukrainian, Norwegian, Swedish, Greek, Turkish, French, German, Spanish. Just a whole wide variety of languages. Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Polish. All of these languages, so there's huge variety in the names of white people. But among black people, the list is, dramatically smaller. The top 10 black names, last names in the United States are Williams, Johnson, Smith, Jones, Brown, Jackson, Davis, Thomas, Harris, and Robertson. That's 13 million African Americans with just those 10 names, last names. Why? Because they were the names of English ancestry slave owners or plantation owners in the South, who, and the enslaved people acquired those names. And, the vast, over 80% of all the people with the last name of Washington in the United States are black, for example. So when Katherine Harris took the Florida felon list, she also did this with the Texas felon list, she also did this with the Florida felon list, and compared it with the Florida voter list, guess what? That felon list was mostly black and Hispanic names. Hispanic names, same thing. They all come from Spanish. And so it's a small universe of names. In fact, the top 10 Spanish names in the United States represent 34 million Hispanic people. So when she did that comparison, what it did was it flagged tens of thousands of Floridians with similar last names. And by the way, they told the vendor to do a loose association. So if the middle name was different, or if the first name was just an initial, or the address was different, it didn't matter. That person got flagged as a felon and got kicked off the voting rolls. And that's how Jeb Bush was able to winnow down the list in Florida. So now we got Ron DeSantis, and he just put this guy, this former state representative, his name is Cord Bird, whose wife is an absolute Trump-humping, Proud Boy-loving activist, and he, Bird, was the principal sponsor of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, as well as co-sponsoring a draconian abortion ban, legislation to ban teachers from discussing race, and legislation aimed at trans people and immigrants. He's now the Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State is supposed to be confirmed by the Florida Senate. But DeSantis is not going to allow those hearings. So this guy's going to be the acting Secretary of State for a long time. Why doesn't DeSantis want those hearings? Democrats are demanding them. DeSantis does not want the hearings because he doesn't want everybody to know, what kind of wackadoodle this guy is, or what kind of sycophant, or what kind of right-wing extremist. This guy still denies that Joe Biden won the election. So I'm telling you, Floridians, if you live in Florida, get ready and start double, and particularly if you're black or Hispanic, but particularly if you're black, if you're African American, get ready, because if they haven't already purged your name from the voting rolls, DeSantis has got, what, about 6 months to do it? Keep in mind, he won the election in 2018 by 0.5%. It's going to be a tight race, particularly against Charlie Crist, who's the most likely candidate. I realize the Democratic primary isn't until August 23rd, but, you know, Charlie Crist he was the former governor. He used to be a Republican, then he became a Democrat, and now he's running against DeSantis. And he's well-liked in Florida. The only way DeSantis, in my opinion, can win this thing is by purging the voter rolls. Get ready.